Welcome to the Books of Titans podcast, where I seek truth in the world's best books. I'm your host, Eric Rostad, coming to you from the beautiful Books of Titans studio in Franklin, Tennessee. My goal is to read 52 books per year and share what I'm learning. I'll talk a bit about each book, tie ideas together from a variety of genres, and share the one thing I always hope to remember from each book. Today I'm going to cover From the Holy Mountain by William Dalrymple, A Journey Among the Christians of the Middle East. This is book 35 of 52 for my 2022 reading list. Well, the year is 578 AD, and John Moschos and his pupil Sophronius, the sophist, are traveling around the Byzantine East. They are going to different monasteries, and they're seeking the wisdom of the monks, the sages, the mystics, the desert fathers of that time. They're starting to see the Byzantine world, the Byzantine Empire crumble around them, and they're contemporaries of Muhammad. So they are about, the world is about to experience a birth of a new religion, and this is about to change, this will change this whole area that they're traveling in. And so the premise of this book is William Dalrymple, the author, is seeking to retrace the steps of these two monks 1,400 plus years later and see what's changed, and to see how these Christian communities are, how they're doing in today's time. And so that's the premise. Dalrymple wrote this book in 1997, and many of the monasteries that John Moschos and Sophronius were visiting at that time were still there. So it's 1997. William Dalrymple is able to go to some of these monasteries. So some of the monasteries are still active. Some of them, it's just kind of the buildings. But he's able to go to a lot of these same places. And what we see right away is that if change occurs in these monasteries, it happens very slowly. And so if you're witnessing monks today, chances are a lot of their traditions, a lot of their songs, a lot of the method and ways that they do things have not changed all that much since John Moschos was there 1,400 years ago. So it's just kind of a neat thing to consider as you're going through this book. One other just really interesting thing is that Sophronius, the pupil of John Moschos, ends up becoming the Patriarch of Jerusalem later on. So again, this is occurring before Islam, but John Moschos is alive at the time of Muhammad. So it's the birth of this, about to be the birth of this new religion. Dalrymple's retracing these steps. He starts in Greece. He moves on to Istanbul, which was Constantinople during Moschos' time, and it's actually the place where Moschos wrote his book called The Spiritual Meadow, and that was the book about his travels. And it was one of the most popular books at that time. So after Constantinople, Istanbul, William Dalrymple next goes to Turkey, then to Syria, then to Lebanon, then to Israel, and then on to Egypt. So you see the Christian communities in these different areas. William Dalrymple is a journalist, and so that's kind of his main method of pursuing this. He's going as a journalist, so he's seeking to learn. He's seeking to obviously retrace John Moschos' steps, but also to see how the community is faring in today's age. So he asks some basic questions like what is causing the population of Christians in these different areas to go down? Is it Islamic fundamentalism? Is it emigration for better opportunities elsewhere? Is it persecution? Is it, what is it? Why are the community of Christians, which in the past were strong, why are they disintegrating? So I love those kind of constraints, just this idea of trying to retrace someone's steps and do that 1400 years later. A book I read a few years ago for this project by William Dalrymple was called In Xanadu, and that was his first book. And in that book, he retraces Marco Polo's journey from Jerusalem to China. And that was very interesting as well. I have read other William Dalrymple books. In 2007, I studied in India for a while, and not for a while, but I was there for a month. And while I was there, I'm sorry, William Dalrymple, but I would buy your books from these. You were not getting any money from these because these were just ripped off books, but they were books about India that William Dalrymple had written, and I really enjoyed those. I also read one that he wrote about the British when they were in Afghanistan, and that was also fascinating. So I have a lot of experience with William Dalrymple. I've really enjoyed his books. And so I think it was last year, I sent him a message on Twitter and I said, of all of your books, which one would you recommend the most? And this is the one that he said, From the Holy Mountain. So I bought it right away, and then added it to this year's list. So it's kind of the story of why I read it, but, also just know that I have read a lot of his books. I really enjoy them, and I've learned a lot from the author. So I was happy to get into this book. For reading stats, it's a 454-page book. Took me over 12 hours to read. That was over 17 days. I've been busy with work. There was some travel while I was reading this. And so I was reading 27 pages per day on this book, which is kind of on the low end of my books this year. But that does not mean that I did not enjoy it. I thoroughly enjoyed it. I just had so much going on that I couldn't read as fast as I need to get through all my books, and that a speed that I would rather like to, just to kind of read it faster and have it be more compact. So for the rest of this segment, or for the rest of this episode, I'm going to cover two other segments here. The next segment will just be a few things that stuck out in the book. And then in segment 3, I'll cover the one thing, my one key takeaway, the thing that I'm still thinking about after reading From the Holy Mountain. One idea I mentioned in the first segment that I thought about a lot while I was reading this book was just that idea that sacred traditions change very slowly through the ages. And so William Dalrymple, as he's in some of these monasteries, he's sharing some of the things that he's witnessing. And in one of them, he was witnessing this song, and he's just thinking, this is probably very similar to how these songs were originally done. And if you're considering perhaps some of the oldest songs in Christendom, he was probably hearing some of them. If we take that premise that some of the sacred traditions have changed very slowly, if at all, over time. So it's just really neat to think about. So you've got songs, you've got just habits and methods of worshiping, methods of being, methods of living in these monasteries. And so I really enjoyed that. I enjoyed thinking about that. I enjoyed reading about that as he was traveling to these different areas. He made a few statements that I thought were really cool. So the first is this: relics were holes in the curtain wall separating the human from the divine. Relics, every monastery you'd go to, they would have a relic. Now, whether they were real or not was another thing, but people believed that they were real. And Dalrymple states that they were holes in the curtain wall separating the human from the divine. So these relics might be like the bone of a saint, or a sliver from the cross, or something like that. And a hole in the curtain separating the human from the divine. I liked that picture. Another thing he said was that Byzantine holy men believed suffering wore away the curtain that separated the visible world from the divine. So again, that idea, there's this separation, but there's kind of these holes in that there's ways where the divine gets through to the visible world, and Byzantine men at that time believed that suffering was one way where that could happen. And so you have these things called stylites that would go on columns. They would stand on high columns and just stay there the entire day and talk or shout to people from up there. But the point was to suffer. They'd be in the sun all day. There's not, they're not eating and drinking, and they're not on ground. They're way up, and people would come from all over to gain wisdom from them. And you don't hear about stylites nowadays, but they were very popular at that time. I wanted to read too that I'm just going to read. It's like four sentences or four kind of short thoughts here about some of the different areas that Dalrymple traveled to, that was along the path that Moschos took. And the reason I want to read this is that this is just a very short highlight of what Dalrymple found when he was in these places. And the reason I want to highlight this is I hope you'll read this book too, and I hope this sparks an interest in you wanting to get to know more behind the story of the different communities in these areas and what they're up to now. So let's start with Turkey. In southeast Turkey, the Syrian Christians were caught in the crossfire of a civil war, a distinct ethnic group trodden underfoot in the scrummage between two rival nationalisms, one Kurdish, the other Turkish. Here it was their ethnicity as much as their religion which counted against the Christians. They were not Kurds and they were not Turks, therefore they did not fit in. So that was for Turkey. Now let's go to Lebanon. In Lebanon, the Maronites had reaped a bitter harvest of their own sowing. Their failure to compromise with the country's Muslim majority had led to a destructive civil war that ended in a mass emigration of Christians and a proportional diminution in Maronite power. So that was Lebanon. Now let's go to Israel. The dilemma of the Palestinian Christians was quite different again. Their problem was that, like their Muslim compatriots, they were Arabs in a Jewish state, and as such suffered as second-class citizens in their own country, regarded with a mixture of suspicion and contempt by their Israeli masters. However, unlike most of the Muslims, they were educated professionals and found it relatively easy to emigrate, which they did en masse. Very few were now left. So there we have Palestinian Christians in Israel. Last one here is Egypt. So only in Egypt was the Christian population unambiguously threatened by a straightforward resurgence of Islamic fundamentalism. And even there, such violent fundamentalism was strictly limited to specific Cairo suburbs and a number of towns and villages in Upper Egypt, even if some degree of discrimination was evident across the country. So those are four different areas and how the population of Christians in those areas is diminishing. It's not just because of Islamic fundamentalism. Now, this book was written before 2001, and so it'd be interesting for him to maybe revisit this and maybe do an update. But in only one of the areas was the population kind of solely threatened by Islamic fundamentalism. In the other areas, it was emigration, it was not being the right ethnic group, it was, and then in Lebanon, it was something completely different. So this is what this book goes into. So yes, Dalrymple is retracing the steps of John Moschos, but he's also seeing the Christian communities in these areas. He's meeting the Christians there. He's talking to them, and he's finding out, what happened, or what's your life like, and are you scared? And so it's just a very neat look, and that's just a brief intro of some of the things that he found, and I hope that sparks an interest for you to look further. In the next segment, I will cover my one key takeaway from this book. One of my favorite parts of this book was where Dalrymple kind of discovers, in a way, it's kind of known, but he discovers in particular iconography that originated in Egypt with the Coptic Christians there, how that showed up in Scotland and Ireland around the time that John Moschos was writing his book. So 1400 plus years ago, you're seeing influence from Egypt to Scotland and Ireland. And so just even the question, how did that happen? How did it get there? And Dalrymple offer some ideas for that. But here's a statement. Certainly there is a growing body of evidence to suggest that contact between the Mediterranean and the Celtic fringe was possible. And if we take a step back from that, you could say a thesis of this book would be, and this is a direct quote, Christianity is an Eastern religion which grew firmly rooted in the intellectual ferment of the Middle East, end quote. And you might think, yeah, duh, that's obvious. But in this book, you see that influence, and you see the influence of these Christian communities, these monasteries, these Byzantine Christians and holy men and sages and wise men, and you see their influence through history. And it's so interesting. And to understand Christianity, you've got to understand this, that it is an Eastern religion that was rooted in the intellectual ferment of the Middle East. And so, yes, on the one hand, to understand that, but then what do you do with actually visiting these places and seeing the Christian community there almost near extinction? And so that's the balance of this book. That's the tension of this book, is just look at this influence. And yet, if you go there now, the people are scared, like they're moving away. And it's just a fascinating look at all of that. And so if you're interested at all in the history of Christianity, if you're interested at all in the current state of different areas of the Middle East, and particularly the Christian community in different areas of the Middle East, if you're just interested in kind of hearing a journalist point of view of this and retracing the steps of two men from 1400 years ago, going to some of the same places, this is a really neat book in that sense. So I hope you will pick it up. I hope you do read it. It was very interesting. I've already suggested it to a number of people. That's going to do it for this episode. Thank you for listening. I'd love to hear from you if you've read this book or maybe some other books by William Dalrymple. You can email me at eric@booksoftitans.com and let me know what you thought of this book or others by Dalrymple. I will be back in a few weeks or next week covering another book from this year's reading list. So until then, keep listening, keep reading, and keep learning. I'm out.